fish bones. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks.
Someone on Zoom confirm. I see the mic going up and down, but just want to make sure that you guys can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. I got you.
Okay, I think I hear you talking, but the audio is really low on this one too.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. All right, it's 4 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. Made it to the second day of class, end of the first week, so hopefully everyone's feeling good. Okay, so the plan for today is we're going to go over basic anatomy today, and so this is kind of the scene that you'll see at the beginning of every lecture. So I'll have a list of learning objectives today. Today is kind of unique in that it's kind of an absurd number of learning objectives, and so usually it's not 14 of them like this. Usually it's something more like 3 or 4 of them. So today's a little bit special just because there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of facts, just because there's lots of names for the different muscles and bones that we're going to go over today. But it's going to be a lot more reasonable after this. Okay. But like I mentioned on Tuesday, that what I recommend, maybe not today because there's a lot of them, but what I recommend at the beginning of every lecture, you come in, you're going to start your page of notes for today. Write down the learning objectives for that day, because then you can kind of see at the top, what kind of as an outline of what we're going to cover that day. So it's kind of a good way for you to organize your notes. It's a good way to organize your information. Okay. I think that's it. I'm working on your guys' first homework assignment, but I probably won't get that out to you guys until next week. So we'll probably talk about that on Tuesday. Okay. All right. Any questions I can answer before we get started for today?
Isn't the homework assignment due on the 1st, I think, for this class?
So the homework assignment will be due. I always give at least a week to do it. So it's not going to be due anytime next week. It'll be due sometime the week after that, either Tuesday or Thursday of the next week.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. By the way, is the audio levels okay for Zoom? You guys can hear me clearly? I'm going to assume that's yes, hopefully. I can't hear that well out of the podium here, and so probably the best way for Zoom is for you guys to talk through chat. Yeah. Chat. Awesome. Good. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So if these lecture slides take the whole time, then that's fine. But then if we end early, then I brought other lecture notes to start today as well. Okay. And so just like I mentioned, so the the topic for today is going to be skeletal and muscle anatomy. Okay, so what is anatomy? So anatomy is probably a word that you've heard in other contexts before, but anatomy is simply just the names of all the bones, muscles, joints, and regions of the body, right? And so it's basically just the naming convention. Okay. And so, I chose to start here for the class because, before we can start talking about the motion and the biomechanics of the human body, we should know, the correct terms at which to refer to everything. Okay. Because, anytime it's just like in language, right? And so in order to actually start, conversing with someone or to start, analyzing things, you have to have a consistent naming basis to refer to the same parts. So everyone knows what everyone's talking about at the same time. Okay. And so, when you say it like that, it seems like it's a very basic idea to just know the names of stuff. But I think this is the part where a lot of people kind of get intimidated with a lot of just not only biomechanics, but just biological stuff in general, because I will say that biologists are terrible namers of things. And so for some reason, they just love to come up with the longest, most complex names for like the simplest of stuff. And so people look at, this name of a bone that's like, 24 letters long, and it's like, what the heck does that mean? And so, it is intimidating, and unfortunately, I'm not an authority in the field where I can just rename these stuff kind of willy-nilly. So we got to go with the names that they're called. Unfortunately, a lot of these names, they kind of just take a lot of time and a lot of practice to kind of get used to them. Okay. And so don't think of today's lecture as something that you have to know everything kind of right away, because I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you, a lot of diagrams at you, and it's going to be a lot to absorb in kind of a short amount of time. And so what I recommend to everyone instead is just to, download this set of lecture notes. I mean, you should download all the lecture notes, but kind of keep this as a reference as we go forward in the semester. And so, I try to kind of keep things as clean as I could in these lecture notes so that, you can refer to certain parts, say like, okay, what's the name of that bone? What's the name of that muscle? Then you can kind of refer to, the appropriate part of these lectures. Okay? And so don't feel like you have to kind of memorize everything at this time, because ultimately that's kind of what it's going to be at the end of the day. And so it's going to be a lot of memorization for, what terms and what parts of the body that they refer to. Okay. And so, I want to do this, I chose to kind of do this very quickly because I want to get much more into the mechanics part of biomechanics, and just the terminology is something you just kind of have to get through right away. And so, I'm going to present the names to you now, but, we're going to be referring back to these a lot throughout the semester. Okay. And so where we're going to start is with this idea of what's called gross body modeling, or whole body modeling. Okay. And so this is basically looking at the human frame as kind of an entire entity, and then breaking it up into different segments. Okay. And so if you look at the human body, you can kind of break it up into 17 major segments, right? And so these segments are kind of defined loosely by the size of the major bones that are in that area, right? And so, this kind of roughly breaks a lot of the limbs, a lot of the parts of your body down into like an upper section, a lower section, and sometimes a middle section as well. Okay. And what's nice about this system here is that, each of the regions or each of the sections of the body have very distinct geometrical and anatomical features that kind of make it unique to all the other parts. Okay? And as you can imagine, this is really important because when you're describing things like injury, it's important to refer to the correct part of the body. Okay? And so here are all the sections that are numbered, right? And so, like I said, this is kind of a big list, but a lot of these are probably what you intuitively know already, right? And so like we have, the first thing you'll notice is that, the numbering system starts at the pelvis, number 1 right here, right? And the reason we do that is because the pelvis is often seen as kind of like the central focal point of the body, right? And so if you consider all of the mass of the segments of the human body and you kind of find its center of mass, for most people is going to be around that kind of pelvis area, right? And so that's kind of where we start the numbering. And so number 1 is the pelvis, 2 is the midriff or the mid-torso, 3 is the chest, right? And then from there we go down the arms. And so we have the left upper arm, the left lower arm, the left hand, and then we go up to the neck and the head, 7 and 8. Okay. And so the numbers aren't that important for this. What's kind of more important here are just the names of the different sections. Right? And so I've numbered them just to make it easier to label and to make a figure out of it. But just think of them as those parts of the body that you kind of already understand. Okay. And for certain applications too, you might have more detailed anatomical models, right? And so if you want to look more closely at the head and the spine, we have more detailed models for that. Or in this case, we have a detailed model of the hand as well, right? So we're not going to spend too much time on these kind of models, but I do want to make you aware that they are out there. Okay. I'll leave it here for a second in case you guys are writing it down, but are there any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay. And so those are the sections of the body, right? So that's kind of the first thing to do, first thing to go over. But the next part is going to be terminology for position and direction within those body segments. Okay. And so this is important because, breaking up the body into those different sections is a good first step, but a lot of times you want to refer to specific locations within that section. Right? And so as an example, let's say that you have an injury in your left lower leg, but that could be anywhere from, your knee all the way down to your ankle, right? And so you want to make sure that you have more terminology to kind of refer which parts of the left lower leg that you're talking about, okay? And so just like we usually do in a lot of engineering situations when we need to talk about position, it's useful to have a coordinate system. And so in this particular case, we have a Cartesian coordinate system, right? Where we have the X, Y coordinates and the Z coordinate. Okay? So the Z direction is pointing up and down on the person's body. The X direction is pointing forward and back, and the left, and the Y direction is pointing to the left and the right. Okay. And then using that coordinate system, we can define what's called the principal planes. Okay. And so if you think of an XY coordinate system, for an XY coordinate system, we have three principal planes, right? We have the XY plane, we have the XZ plane, and the YZ plane. Okay. And so we can split the body into those kind of planes as well, right? And we've given them specific names kind of based on how they split the body, right? And so there's three principal planes here. So first of all, we have the coronal plane, okay? And so the coronal plane, what I like to think about it as, if you draw kind of a stick figure and you kind of draw the stick figure kind of standing up like this, that's kind of the plane of the coronal plane, right? And so it's a plane that kind of splits, it kind of splits your body and kind of splits you, if you look on one side of the coronal plane, that's the front of your body, and on the other side of the coronal plane is the back of the body, okay? The next plane is the transverse plane, and so that's kind of a plane that kind of slices you down your, down your stomach, right? And so I think of the transverse plane as kind of like the magician's plane, because I think probably a magician's trick you've all seen is, someone's like sitting in a box and the magician saws the person in half, right? And he opens up the cross section. And so that's the transverse plane, okay? And so the transverse plane is the magician's plane, which splits your body into an upper section and a lower section, okay? And then finally, we have the sagittal plane. And so the sagittal plane is kind of split kind of right in the plane of your nose, okay? And so that splits your body into a left section and a right section, right? And so, for this one, the figure is here, but because this figure is not the best because this person is like a Slender Man kind of 2D kind of dude. And so, I actually find it more useful to kind of remember the actual text definitions for these ones. Okay. Any questions on this?
Origins just at section 1.
Yeah, origin section 1. Yeah. So whenever we have any kind of like coordinate system, just kind of always assume that the origin is going to be around the pelvis. Okay. And so for kind of whole body modeling, we have that origin at the pelvis, but a lot of times it's also useful to have a lot of local coordinate systems as well. Okay. And so what these are referring to are these are reference configurations. Okay. And so we're not going to do too much with it in the first part of the class, but once we get to the second half of the class where we actually talk about human motion, human dynamics, this is going to be a lot more useful. Okay. And so the basic idea is that you're going to draw a coordinate system or coordinate axes on every segment of the body, right? And they're going to be located at kind of the center of mass of each segment. Okay. Because what's going to be important in human motion is to describe, the relative orientation of one body segment to another, right? And so if you have your arm kind of like this, right, you can describe its motion by saying that the arm is being flexed like this, right? And one way that we can describe it is that if we fix coordinate axes to your upper and lower arm, they're going to change orientation relative to each other as the arm is in motion, okay? And so, it's kind of a confusing concept just because there's a lot of coordinate axes to look at. But we'll be dealing with this a lot more in the second half of the class. Okay. All right. And so next thing is relative terminology, right? And so I would say these terms are more used for in the medical field. And so in addition to the different segments of the body and in addition to the principal planes, it's useful to have additional terms to describe kind of relative locations. Okay. And so there are 8 terms to know. And they all kind of, and each of them kind of come in pairs, right? And so one is kind of opposite of the other. Right? And so when we say something is superior, what we mean is that's going to be something towards the head. Okay? And inferior means something that's towards the feet. Okay? And so just as a very basic example, we can say that the shoulders are superior to your knee, right? And so if you look at the relative position of your shoulders, it's located closer to the head compared to your knees, okay? And the opposite is true too. And so we can say that the knees are located inferior to the shoulders. Right, and so that's superior, inferior, and so that one's very straightforward, right? So one's towards the head, one's towards the feet. Next, we have anterior and posterior, and so anterior meaning to the front, and then posterior meaning to behind. Okay. Right. So an example for that would be, your nose is located anteriorly to your spine, right? And so if you look at compared to the front of your body to the back, right, your nose is right at the front of your body, whereas your spine is in your back, right? And so that's what we use anterior, posterior for. All right. Next, we have proximal and distal, and so proximal means something that's closer to the torso. And distal is away from the torso. And so I think this is probably, these 2 terms are probably the 2 that you'll hear most often in a lot of, you probably, if you've watched kind of a medical drama show, you might have heard these terms already, okay? And these terms just refer to how much closer that body segment is compared to your torso, right? And so as an example, if you put your hand out like this, right? Or actually, if you put your hand out anywhere, you can say that your hand is more distal than your elbow, right? Because your elbow is located closer to your torso, whereas your hand is located kind of farther away. Okay. And the last 2 relative terms here are medial and lateral, right? So medial means it's going to be closer to the midline of your body, and lateral means it's going to be further away from the midline. All right, so it's a lot of terms, I know. I think it's been like it's been 15 minutes, and I think I've thrown like 20 terms at you guys already. So I know it's a lot, but again, the point of today is not to kind of fully retain all of these things. It's just to kind of plant a seed of these are kind of the terms that we're going to be using, and then later on we'll refer back to this. And over the first few weeks, when I say these terms, when I say something like distal and I say something like posterior, anterior, I'll make sure to kind of remind you what those terms mean, but this is kind of the reference for a lot of those terms. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, so now we have movement terminology, and so these are terms that we can use to describe movements of the different parts of the body. Okay. And so we have a lot of terms for these because the movement of the human body is very complex, and so we need a lot of terms to describe it. Okay, but at the very basic sense, we have this idea of flexion and extension. Okay, and so whenever you have a part of your body that undergoes some kind of bending motion, we call that flexion, right? And so I think the most basic example of this is that if you take your arm and you kind of flex your biceps, that's known as flexion, right? And so because you're bending your body, so we're basically bringing 2 segments of your body and we're bringing them closer to each other by action of a muscle, right? And so by flexing your bicep, by flexing at your elbow, you're bringing your lower arm and your upper arm closer together, right? So that's why we call it flexion. Okay. And so the opposite of flexion is extension. And so when you bring two parts of your body further apart, oftentimes it's going to have a straightening out motion. We call that extension, right? And so when you extend your arm outwards like this, that's extension, because you're taking your upper arm, your lower arm, and you're making them further away from each other. Okay. And because we're coming from an engineering background, we have to be careful saying the word extension, because when we say extension in kind of a solid mechanics point of view, sometimes what we mean is that whatever bar or whatever material that we're looking at is actually getting longer in length, right? And so it's like stretching out. But we don't mean that in biomechanics. And so when we say extension in biomechanics, all we mean is just straightening out. And so it's not actually getting longer. It's not elongating. It's just going from a flex position to a straightened out position. Okay. All right, so that's flexion and extension. Right? Any questions on this? Okay, so here are some other movement terminologies, right? And so we have lateral bending, right? So remember, lateral meaning you're going away from the center of your body, right? So when you kind of tilt your head to the side, that's known as a lateral bending, because you're taking your head and you're moving it away from the midline of your body. Okay. We also have rotation, and so we have quite a few joints in your body that are counted as like a ball and socket joint. And so in those type of joints, you can rotate it, right? And so your neck is one of those joints, so you can rotate your neck. Okay. For me right now, it's a little painful because I slept on kind of a weird position, but you can rotate your neck, you can rotate your arm. Okay. And in particular for your arm, we have two special terms to describe whether you're opening your arm up or rotating your arm down, right? And so for rotating your arm up, where your palm is facing up, that's known as supination. Okay. And the way I remember this term is that you're opening up your palm to carry a bowl of soup, right? And so that's what this guy is doing. He's carrying a bowl of soup. And the opposite of supination is pronating. So you're pronating your palm down. Okay. You'll hear me kind of give a lot of weird or funny kind of ways to remember these things, because it's honestly it's so many terms, and like I said, the naming convention for this makes no sense. Like they use such long words, and so what I find helps is to come up with kind of weird kind of ways, weird kind of tricks to kind of remember these things. And so I'll give you kind of the tricks that I use whenever I see them, but you guys can feel free to come up with your own as well. Okay. All right. So the next terms that we have are abduction and adduction. Okay. And so adduction, the key words for this are add. Okay. Oh, sorry. There's a chat. Oh yeah, supination, pronation. Yeah. And so supination is when you're kind of rotating your arm so that your palm is facing upwards. Okay. And so think of supination as like you're opening your palm up, or you're rotating your palm up so that you can hold a bowl of soup. Okay. And then pronation is the opposite. And so pronation is you're rotating your palm downward. Okay. Supination and pronation. Okay. Next we have adduction and abduction and adduction. Okay. Yeah. So they're both a rotating motion. And so one's rotating upwards, one's rotating downwards. Yeah. Upwards meaning closer to your head, downwards closer to your feet. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right, next we have adduction and abduction. Okay, so I think the easiest way to illustrate this is with your legs. Okay, and so I'll do abduction first, because normally we're kind of adducted. And so when you're abducting something, you're taking that limb away from the center line. Okay, and so just like this person here, if you kind of rotate your leg, you swing your leg kind of outwards, then that's abduction. Okay, but when you bring a limb kind of back closer to your body, we call that adduction. And there's kind of a funny way to remember this too. So I remember this by looking at add for adduction. Right? And so when you adduct something, you're adding something to kind of the midline of your body. So you're kind of bringing it back in. Okay. And so that's how I kind of remember adduction versus abduction. So most of the times it's fine to just kind of remember one kind of silly thing for one part, and then just remember that the other name is just the opposite of that. And so I don't have a silly way to remember abduction, but adduction I remember as, you add to your body, and then abduction is just the opposite of that. Okay. All right, so next we have a little bit of a weird one, and I will say that this picture does a terrible job of showing this. Okay. But we have varus and valgus, okay? And so these are primarily used to describe the motion of your feet, okay? And so the easiest one to kind of think of first is actually valgus. And so valgus is when you kind of point your feet kind of outwards in a V formation, okay? And so when you point your toes outwards, that's valgus. And then when you point your toes back inwards, that's varus, okay? So valgus, point your toes outward, varus, point your toes inward. I like sumo. Oh, I actually don't know much about sumo, but if they use that terminology, then yeah. Okay, and so more stuff with the feet. So your feet are very important, and so there's actually a lot of biomechanics that are involved. Like we talked about last time with running shoes with your feet. Your ankle is actually a very fascinating joint because it's so important, and there's so much riding on your ankles. But it's actually one of the loosest joints in your body too. So that's why people sprain their ankles so much. It's because there's so much weight on it, but there's just relatively little support. And it's actually kind of an awkward fit between the bones between the two. So it's fascinating that we kind of evolved to have such weird ankles. Okay, and so the next two foot motion terms that we'll talk about are plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Okay? And so plantar flexion is when you kind of flex your toes downwards to plant them into the ground. So that's kind of how I remember plantar flexion. Right? And so whenever you take a step, right? Whenever you take a step off that foot, you're planting that foot into the ground and you're kind of driving your toes downward, which kind of gives you that motion to go forward. Okay. And so dorsiflexion is the opposite of that. So dorsiflexion means you're kind of bringing your toes upwards. Okay. And so the way I remember dorsiflexion is that think of like the dorsal fin of a dolphin, right? And so the dorsal fin kind of raises upwards, and so on the back of a dolphin. And so when your foot does the same thing, you kind of bring the toes up. You make it. I know it doesn't look anything like a dorsal fin, but I think of it as like forming that kind of fin. Okay. So plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. So these two are opposites. And then finally, we have the two ankle breaking motions. And so we have eversion and inversion. Okay. And so eversion is kind of when you kind of rest on the inner parts of your foot. Okay. And so that's when you kind of say these are your two ankles, and you kind of bring the outsides of your foot kind of up like that. Okay. And then inversion is the opposite. Okay. So inversion is when you kind of do like this with your foot. And so most ankle sprains are of the inversion variety. Just because of kind of how people run, how people do basketball, things like that. Okay. Another reason for that is that the ligaments that are supporting the ankle in this direction are much weaker, and so what you'll see is that when you do invert your foot and it's kind of in a very fast kind of violent motion, you end up with an ankle sprain. So this is people call this the ankle spraining motion right here. Okay. And so it's a lot less common for people to sprain their ankles in the eversion way, just because it's not a natural way to bend at all. And usually you're not put in situations where you bend your foot in eversion. But when you do sprain your ankle in eversion, it's actually pretty serious because that ligament, even though it's a lot stronger, if you do actually hurt that ligament, it's going to take longer to heal. It's going to be a lot more painful. So again, inversion ankle sprains more common, but eversion ankle sprains, when it does happen, it's quite painful. All right, any questions on this? Okay, and so that's all the motion terms that we'll go over for now. Okay. And so again, it's a lot of terms, but just going to use this as a reference. Next, we'll go over actual anatomy. Okay, so first we're going to start with bones. Okay, and so your skeleton is made up of bones, right? And so the bones, what their main purpose in your body is to provide the main structural strength for your body. Okay, and so every single bone in your body, there's like 200 something of them, has a specific name. Okay, That means, yes, each individual rib and each individual spine bone has its own name. Okay, that's why there's so many of them. But for our purposes, it's not that important to actually remember all those different names, right? And so, that's kind of a sadistic thing to do, to make you remember all those names, because some of them have names longer than like 20 letters, which is absurd. And so I think what's going to be more important is to just remember kind of some of the major bones. Okay. In particular, the bones to focus on are going to be bones that are kind of in this shape, which are your long bones, right? And so the bones that comprise your limbs, and so the bones that mainly comprise your legs and your arms. And so we'll be focusing a lot on that in this class, because those are the most interesting ones in terms of motion. Okay. And we'll be talking about the spine a lot in this class as well. So once we get to kind of the spinal unit, we'll be talking about the different kind of vertebrate bones in there as well. Okay. But again, I'm not giving you all the names of every little bone in the body. I probably only know like 20 of them. And so I wouldn't expect you guys to know more than that either. But just know that every bone has a name, but most of them are not that important. Okay. And in particular, the one I want to mention, just because I'm going to refer back to it, because it's honestly, I think it's the most beautifully designed bone in the body, is the femur. Okay, so the thigh bone. And so the thigh bone is the largest bone in the body, and just the way it's designed is beautiful. You'll see once we get there. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the structure of your long bones. Okay. And so, even though every bone in your body has a different size and shape, right? A lot of the long bones have generally the same structure, right? And so they have, they are generally cylindrical in shape, and they have kind of somewhat rounded ends. Okay. And so the cylindrical shaft is often called the diaphysis. Yeah. Okay. And the rounded ends are called the epiphysis. Okay. And so generally how these are is that kind of the diaphysis is made up of very hard, compact cells. Okay. And the reason for that is the shaft part kind of constitutes the main structural strength of the bone, whereas the rounded parts, the epiphyses, are more soft, because those are the ones that contact the joints. And so there's kind of more impact forces on those ones. Okay? And actually today, I think we'll have time. We'll actually start talking about, we'll cover bones kind of a more specific. Okay. Okay. All right, and so here is how the skull is arranged. And so we have, right now, I don't have many plans to talk much about the skull, even though the skull obviously is very important. But here are the different regions of the skull. Okay? What's interesting about the skull is that I think when people think about the skull bone in particular, they think that it's just kind of one big bone that's all interconnected. But that's actually not the case. So your skull is actually formed of all these different segments, and they may look connected, but then there actually are some gaps in the skull. Okay? And the reason for that is to help accommodate growth of the skull. Okay? Because the skull is unique in that it's, compared to a lot of bones in your body, it has a very rounded kind of contour, because your brain has to fit inside of it. And so in order for it to have space to grow from when you're a little baby to you're an adult, it has to have ways for it to expand. And the way that your body kind of figured that out is to kind of split your brain into, or split your skull, into these different segments. Okay. And so we have the occipital bone, the parietal bone, the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, and the temporal bone. Okay. And when your skull grows as you kind of mature as an adult, what happens is that kind of these segments right here kind of grow, and they kind of push each other out, which allows your skull to grow. All right, so here's the spine, and so we'll go over this. We have a unit on spinal biomechanics later on in the course, but I did want to just briefly mention the 4 segments of your spine. Okay. And so your spine is split into these 4 segments, which are loosely kind of defined by the curvature of the spine. Right? And so if you kind of took a spine out of a living person, you'll see that it kind of has this S shape to it. Right? And so it kind of bends this way first, and then it bends this way, and then it bends this way, and then it kind of curves out right here. So basically every time the shape of the spine changes curvature, we call that a different section. Okay? And so starting at the top, and so your skull is kind of located right around here. The cervical part of your spine is the one that's inside your neck. So that's the top part of the spine. Okay? Next, we have the thoracic spine, which is the spine that's located in your chest area. Okay. Then we have the lumbar spine, and so the lumbar spine is your lower back, and then we have the sacrum, which is basically your tailbone. Okay, so that's kind of the part that kind of extends, right above your butt, basically. Okay. And your spine is again not just one big bone, but it's a bunch of these vertebrate bones that are stacked right on top of each other. Okay. Okay, so let me pause here for a second. So are there any questions on any of this? All right, so now let's talk about joints, right? So joints are another important part of your body. Okay, so joints are basically describing when two major parts or major segments of your body, or more specifically, two major bones, they connect to each other. Okay. And so because your bones are relatively rigid, you can't bend your bone. The way that we get such complex motion is that we get all of these kind of complex kind of interactions at the joints. Okay? And so joints are very important, and healthy joints are actually something that a lot of people struggle with as they get older. Right? And so we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. Right? But for now, it's good to just kind of describe the different types of joints in your body, because depending on how the bones at the joint kind of interact with each other, you're going to get different types of motion. Okay? And so on the one hand, probably the joint that most people think of first is a hinge type joint, right? And so those are joints like at your knee and at your elbow, right? So these are joints that only allow a rotational degree of freedom. Okay, and so there's a very clear hinge and there's a very clear axis of rotation. And when you rotate about that joint, you are doing just what we call 1 degree of freedom. Okay, and so that means we can only rotate, with a specific angle, a specific angular rotation, angular velocity, around that joint. Okay. All right, so number 2 is a slider joint. So these are actually kind of uncommon in your body, or they don't occur in places that you would normally consider as like major joints in your body. But these allow 1 translational degree. Right? And so these joints, the bones at these joints literally just slide past each other. Okay? And so there's no rotating, there's just sliding. Okay? And so where you see sliding joints the most are actually between a lot of the small bones in your hand and your foot and your ankle and your wrist. Okay. All right, and then lastly, the third type of joint is a ball and socket joint, and so this allows the most degrees of freedom. Okay. And so the way you can imagine this is that you have one bone that has kind of a spherical head, and then the other bone kind of forms a socket around that hole. So that bone that's inside the socket is kind of free to rotate in lots of different directions. Okay. And so the way that we describe this kinematically is we say it has 3 rotational degrees of freedom. And so we need 3 angles, theta, phi, and beta. I think those are the 3 traditional angular degrees of freedom. We need 3 different angles to describe the motion and position of these joints. Okay? And so you don't have many of these joints in your body, but they are in very strategic locations. And so your shoulder joint is obviously one of the ball and socket joints. Right? If you move your arm, you can move your arm in lots of different directions. You can rotate it all different kinds of ways. Okay. And that's a result of the ball and socket joint inside your shoulder and your hip joint too. And so when you're both your legs that are connected to your hip, those are ball and sockets. And so if you try to move your leg around, right, rotate around your hip, there's a lot of different things you can do because that's also a ball and socket joint. Okay. So these are not the only joint classifications, but I think this covers the vast majority of joints that you see in your body. And the important thing to remember is that these are only approximations, right? And so I would say these are kind of mechanical analogs for for these joints. Okay? Just know that the real joints in your body have oftentimes have a little bit more limitations than what these kind of descriptions kind of describe, and sometimes they might have some extra motions as well. Okay. And so one example is your knee, right? So most people consider your knee joint primarily a hinge joint, but you can actually kind of slide the knee kind of to the left and to the right a little bit, especially if you look at your kneecap. You know, my friend is really good at this, and he always grosses me out. And so like he takes the kneecap, he kind of like jiggles it around his entire knee. And I'm like, that's gross, man. But you know, that's kind of an example of a joint that has more motions than what it initially says. And if you look at your hip joint and your shoulder joint too, you know, you don't have a full 360 degrees range of motion in all directions, right? Because your body gets in the way, and you can only extend your arm up kind of past a certain point too, because of the anatomical. And so just know that when we refer to certain joints with certain names like this, they're only approximations. They're not full. They're not full descriptions of all the motion that's possible. Okay. Any questions on this? All right, and so next, let's go over the major muscle groups. Okay, and so the muscles, just like the bones, there's so many different muscles in your body with extremely long names that make no sense at all. And so, again, we're not going to go over every single small muscle in the body. Okay, and in fact, we're actually not going to be talking about specific muscles much at all in this class. But we are going to talk about muscles a lot, but we're going to talk about kind of how muscles work in general. Okay? But again, it is good to know kind of what the general names of certain muscle groups are in your body. Okay. And so this figure here kind of shows kind of some of the more major muscles that we'll talk about. Okay. And so you're free to kind of write that down. But in addition to kind of the names of muscles right here, I want to talk about 3 different kinds of muscles that we have in our body. Okay? Because when we think of muscles, oftentimes we think of actually category 3 right here. Okay, and so most of the muscles that we think about in our body belong to a group called skeletal muscles, and these are muscles that are responsible for connecting to your bones. Okay, so that's why they're called skeletal muscles. And so your skeletal muscles are the ones that are responsible for kind of a large body movement. And so, all the muscles here are skeletal muscles. So your quadricep, your deltoid, your trapezius, triceps, biceps, hamstrings, gastrocnemius, right? So all of those are skeletal muscles because they're responsible for connecting to your skeleton and moving the bones in your skeleton relative to each other. Okay. And so, of course, for this class, we're going to be focusing mostly on skeletal muscles. But there are other types of muscles in your body too, because there's other parts of your body that have to move as well. Okay? And so the first other type of muscle you'll see is called the cardiac muscle. Okay? And so this specifically refers to the muscles that are inside your heart. Okay? And so the reason they have a different name than all the other muscles is that they have a very, very unique structure that kind of makes them operate, literally 24/7. Right? And so your heart never really stops beating. And the reason for that is your cardiac muscles are designed in such a way that they can, pump blood all the time and without really much stimulation from the brain as well. Okay. And so they're designed in a way so that they have kind of ultra endurance. Okay. Because if you think about a lot of the other muscles in your body, so, let's say that, you do some push-ups, right? It doesn't matter how strong you are, eventually after you do enough push-ups, your arms are going to get fatigued, right? Because they're not designed for, long exposure like that. But your cardiac muscles are. So that's kind of what lets them operate for such long periods of time. Okay. And the other type of muscle that you'll see in your body are what's called smooth muscles. And so these are muscles that line the internal organs in your body, because the internal organs in your body also have to apply some motion. Okay? And so if you think of like your intestines, you think about your esophagus, right? And so that those parts of your body have to contract a little bit to kind of help move stuff through your body. Okay? And so these also have a different structure than skeletal muscles. And so that's why we categorize them as smooth muscles. Okay? But again, the focus for this class, which is mostly human motion, is going to be on skeletal muscles. Okay? All right, and so one thing that's important to remember for muscles is that they're able to contract, right? And so muscles have the ability to get shortened, to get shorter, okay? But they don't have the ability to extend, okay? And so when you think about your biceps, right? So when you flex your biceps, right? you can literally, bunch up your arm and like not flex your biceps at all. And if you pinch it together, that's kind of the same action that your biceps are doing, because, you're pinching it together and you're flexing it. Okay. But when you go to actually extend your arm, what's happening is that your biceps are not actually pushing out, right? So your muscles they cannot push outwards. What happens when you actually extend your limb, then a muscle on the opposing side is actually being contracted. Okay? And so remember, it's possible for muscles to kind of actively contract, but they can't extend themselves. And so in order for a muscle to extend, it needs the help from an opposite muscle on a different side. Okay, any questions on this? Okay. All right, and so finally, the last thing I want to talk about in these slides is this idea of anthropomorphic data, okay? And so a lot of times, when you're doing biomechanical analysis and you want to do quantitative analysis, you need to have some data in terms of, how tall people are, how long certain limbs are, and things like that, okay? And so data like this is constantly being collected on the human population for different age groups, different groups for everything, okay? And they're summarized in data tables, and we call that data anthropomorphic data. Okay? And so it's fairly standardized in terms of what types of measurements that they take. It's just that the values of those measurements change depending on what people that you're looking at. Okay. And so when you're looking at anthropomorphic data, it looks something like this, where you have a person, and we have different measurements that are associated with that person, right? And so you can see measurement A. Measurement A here is just simply the height of that person. Okay. Measurement B here goes up to its eyes, and so that's the height of that person's eyes. Okay. C is shoulder height. Okay. D is waist height, and then E is the height of your butt. Okay. And we have similar measurements for a person that's sitting as well. Okay. And so this is really useful. And so especially if you get into the space of like designing medical devices or devices for people to use, because it's useful to have data on how long you should make your device, or how tall it should be. Okay. And so a lot of devices that are meant to interact with people utilize anthropomorphic data like this. Okay? And so there's tons of data on this online, and you can look up, you can search up lots of them. But the textbook that I'm using actually has some has some measurements here. And so I believe these are measured in meters right here. Okay. And so you can see that for males, these are how tall each of the different males are. And so if you're like an average male, you're about 1.759 meters tall. But if you're in the 95th percentile, you're a tall person, then you're 1.869. Okay. But if you're really short, you're like 1.649 meters tall. Okay. And so again, this data can be useful. And so if you're curious about where you fit among the general population in terms of your height, your shoulder height, waist height, stuff like that, then you can look at this table right here. But of course, I think the easier way just would be to find a table like this online. So the only reason I have this here is just to kind of let you know that this data exists. Okay. I think that's there's more data with it. And so if you want to see more data for sitting, that's kind of where it is. Okay. Any questions on any of this? Okay, all right, and so that's kind of a blitz through anatomy and names for all these things. So I know it was a lot, right? It's a lot of information, right? But again, you guys have these slides. You can download them from the website. Use them as a reference. And I want to at least mention a lot of these terms today, just because as we go through the next few weeks, we'll be talking about a lot of these things. But again, because I know for a lot of you, I know when I first took a course like this, and for me, it wasn't until graduate school actually. For me, the first time when I saw a lot of these terms, it was just really, really overwhelming. And so, for the next few weeks, when I do refer to these things, I'm going to remind you kind of what these terms mean. Just because, just to kind of help with it, right? But I wanted to kind of at least give this kind of like shock exposure so that you can kind of see, how many terms that we need, and so we can kind of get that stuff. Okay, and so we have about 25 minutes left in class, and so I don't want to just kind of end it here. And so I'm going to go ahead and start the next set of lecture notes because we have kind of a lot to cover. But it's kind of in the same vein. And so for the next 2 weeks, starting on next week, we're going to be talking about some of the material properties and some of the general characteristics of the different types of tissue in your body. So we're going to start with bones. Okay, we're going to start with bones today. Then we're going to talk about muscles and then joints. Okay. Okay. And so I'm not sure how far we'll get, but we'll get as far as we can. Okay. And so let's talk about the biomechanics of bones. Okay. And so we just talked about this in the lecture slides, but let's just kind of remind ourselves what the purposes of bones are. Okay. And so there's I would say two main purposes that your skeleton serves. Okay. And so the first purpose, okay, that's probably more important, is to provide a rigid structure and the rigid strength that your body needs. Okay. And so on the one hand, this provides the structural strength for your body. Okay, so when you stand up, it's not absurdly painful, but it also serves to protect a lot of the more delicate parts inside your body. Right? So a lot of your internal organs inside your body, they're not meant to take any kind of physical impact, right? And so the main thing that protects a lot of these delicate organs is the skeleton, right? And that protection can either be directly, and so you might think of like your rib cage, right? So on the inside of your rib cage, you have a lot of very delicate organs like your heart and your lungs. And so in that case, it's literally like a protection cage so that you can't punch your heart, right? But it's also indirect as well. And so, just by having an arm or a leg that provides structure, right? It makes it so that, when you jump up and down or like when you fall from a height, that impact doesn't get transmitted to your internal organs. Right? So your bone's going to absorb a lot of that impact. All right, and so number two, and so the second purpose for the skeleton is to form a rigid system of levers that can be moved by the muscles. And of course, when your bones kind of move relative to each other, this is what we call human motion. Okay. All right. And so, I think last year when I presented this, last year was the first time I taught this. I said, your skeleton provides the skeleton for your body. I'm like, wait, that doesn't make sense. So, it's something that I think we all kind of intuitively understand about the skeleton, but putting it into words, trying to make an analogy of it, realizing that all the analogies that you make are actually of this subject makes it even more difficult. But I think those two statements kind of sum it up pretty well. Okay, and so because of this, you know, and I think, you know, we all kind of understand those parts of the skeleton. When you think of a bone, you think of something that's kind of really hard and rigid, right? Something that's like, you know, really, really rigid. Okay. And I think part of that comes from the fact that, you know, if you look at bones and other animals as well, and for most people, you know, the way that they interact with those types of bones is, you know, when you eat them, right? Not the bones themselves, but, you know, you eat a fried chicken and there's a bone inside that fried chicken, right? And so you try to, you know, eat that bone and you can't, and you hit it against the table. It seems like it's really hard, right? That's not a fair, I'd say that's not a fair, you know, assessment for what a bone's actual properties are, because that animal has been dead for a long time. But, you know, if you look at the bone of an actual living organism, you'll see that it is actually quite complex, and actually has a lot more flexibility than most people kind of give it credit for. Okay. I think, you know, one of the most fascinating things about bones is that, you know, they actually have the ability, it's not a homogeneous material. And so actually what you'll see is that different bones in your body actually can have very, very different properties from each other as well. Okay. And so if you look at the bone properties in your leg, right? And so your leg is, you know, the primary weight supporting bone that you have in your body, right? And so your leg bones are very strong because they need to be, because they're supporting the weight. But if you compare that to the bones in other parts of your bodies, like your arms, you know, you'll see that they actually have very, very different kind of strength properties. Okay? But they're all made of the same material. And so, you know, they're not, you know, your leg bone isn't made of a different material than your arm, but your bones have ways to kind of modify their properties based on their use cases. Okay. And even within the same bone, if you look at different regions of that bone, you know, those different regions are going to have different properties as well, even though they're all made of the same material. Which is crazy when you think about it, right? And so if you think of, like, you know, think of a material that you might be used to working with, like aluminum, right? So you have a bar of aluminum, right? Aluminum is what's known as an isotropic material. So if you look at the properties of aluminum at one end of the rod versus the middle of the rod, it's going to have the same property because it's all a uniform material. Right? Bones can vary, you know, centimeters sometimes, just because of, you know, of how it's designed. So it's fascinating. Right. And so your bone, you know, it's very much a living tissue as any other part of your body. And so maintaining bone health is something that's very important to humans as well, you know, just as important as all the other parts of the body. Okay? And a large, you know, portion of our elderly population actually struggle with their bone health, you know, because they don't take care of it over the years as well. And so part of this is we're going to talk about, you know, how bones actually change as the person ages. and what you can do to actually help maintain that health, for a long period of time. Okay. Okay. Let's see. And so, if you do get into the space of designing medical devices, a good chunk of them, go into, helping to promote good, healthy bones for, a lot of them, of course, are aimed at elderly people. But what you're seeing now is that there's a lot more attention being paid towards, younger people as well, because, we'll talk about this, probably next week because we're almost out of time. But a lot of the bone health that you have actually starts, when you're young. And kind of by the time you get old and you have kind of, crappy bones, there's really nothing you can do about it at that point, because it's not really something that happens suddenly as you age. It's kind of a collection of habits that you kind of form throughout your entire life. And so, taking care of your bones is kind of like a lifelong process, and something that, unfortunately that you don't really realize how bad your bones can be until it's kind of too late. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, all right. So let's start by talking about the composition and the structure of bone tissue. Okay. Okay. And so because of the roles that bones play in your body, they have to have certain characteristics so that they can perform their duties well. Okay. And so number one, it's desirable for your bones to have strength, right? So they have to be strong. And so what I mean by strong is that, if you apply a large amount of force on the bones, right, either compressive or tensile force, they have to be able to withstand it. So they're not just going to break, or they're not going to bend or stretch when you apply the large force. Okay. But another important characteristic of bones, because of their role in motion, is that they also have to be lightweight as well. Okay? The reason for that is to make it easier to kind of move the body. Okay. Right. So if you imagine for a second, if your bones are made of like something really heavy like steel, right? So lifting your arms would be a lot more difficult in that case, right? And so your bones need to be strong and lightweight at the same time. And so it needs to be kind of a unicorn material, right? Because usually those two things don't, you guys know, because you guys are engineers. And so, having a material that's strong and lightweight is tough, unless you're talking like carbon fiber or something. But, no one has carbon fiber bones, not that I know. Okay. All right. So first let's answer the question of, what material was bone made out of, right? And so probably if you grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons, you've probably seen a lot of commercials to drink milk because milk has calcium that makes your bones strong, and that is true. So calcium is a big, it makes up a big makes up a big part of the composition of your bones, but it's not just calcium. Okay, and so the main material constituents are. So first we have calcium carbonate, and so that's where the calcium comes in. Okay, so calcium carbonate is basically a combination of calcium and carbon in a way that makes it structurally strong. Okay. We also have calcium phosphate. Okay, which is another calcium-based molecule, but this time it's a phosphate instead of a carbonate. Okay. But that's it for the calciums. And so there's two more main constituents. And so one of them being collagen, which apparently is a big ingredient in shampoo nowadays. I keep hearing it on the radio, right? And believe it or not, water. Okay. All right, and so each of these different materials plays a different role in establishing the material and establishing the properties of bones. Okay, and so as you can imagine, both the calcium materials here, they add to the bone strength. Okay. Okay. And so that's where most of the strength comes from. Okay. Collagen, which is the, again, like the newest super ingredient that you'll find in Neutrogena shampoo, gives your bones flexibility. Okay. It gives flexibility and it also adds to some strength as well, but collagen mainly helps to add to tensile strength. I should add too. So the calcium type materials, they give the bone strength, but it's a very specific kind of strength. It's compressive strength. Just work it out. Okay. And so if you look at calcium just by itself, calcium is actually quite brittle, right? And so calcium, you can compress it really, really well, and it's not going to break. But as soon as you try to pull on it with tension, calcium actually breaks pretty easily, as well as a lot of materials. And so the collagen is really important because your bones are going to be mostly loaded in compression, right? Especially your weight-bearing bones, they're mostly being compressed. But there are going to be times when your bones are going to be stretched in tension as well. And so you don't want it so that if you apply just a little bit of tensile force to your bones, it's just going to shatter and break, right? And so the collagen plays a really important role so that it kind of has strength that goes both ways, both in terms of compression and tension. And lastly, water. And so water actually makes up a decent amount of the weight of the bone. So water makes up about 30% of the bone weight. My Zoom quit on me. My Zoom's like, time to go home. Okay. And water actually helps contribute to some strength as well. Oh, question.
Yeah, for material constituents, is that by order of like prominence? Like, is there more calcium carbonate?
Yes.
Calcium phosphate?
Yes, yeah, definitely, it definitely is. Oh, well, so collagen, there's probably the least amount of collagen in terms of weight. And so the calcium, both the calcium ones make up about 70% of the bone weight. Sorry, I should have put that. Collagen is actually a very lightweight material, and so it doesn't actually take up that much weight. And so it's there, and it's definitely important, but it doesn't make up much of the weight. And water makes up the rest. And water kind of does a bit of both. So water adds to some flexibility and also adds to some strength as well. But the main reason water is there is to kind of make it easy for nutrients and stuff to kind of flow through the bone. Okay. And so just like all the other tissues in your body, your bone needs nutrients. And the way that it does that is by kind of moving it through fluid, right? And that's the purpose of the water. All right. And so all of these materials play an important role, for the bone in a living person. Okay? What tends to happen, if you extract a bone out of an organism that is dead, what tends to happen is that a couple of things happen. So one thing that happens is that the bone very quickly dehydrates. Okay? Okay. And so a lot of the benefits of the water kind of, it goes away once the animal's passed away. Okay. And the collagen actually gets very stiff as well. Okay? And so that's kind of the primary reason why if you look at bones from either if you've ever seen one before inside a cadaver or inside just a raw chicken or something, you'll see that it is very hard and it feels very brittle because those bones have basically lost all its water content and it's lost all its collagen as well. Most of its collagen, not all of it. And so that's why it appears a lot more stiff than it actually is. But real bones are actually, they do have some flexibility to it because of the water and the collagen. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So one more concept I want to go over before we end for today is the idea of porosity. Listen. All right. And so porosity, it gets its name from the name pores. Okay. And so if you actually cut open a bone, you actually see that it's not a completely solid material. Okay. Okay. And so if you cut kind of a perfect cross section in the bone and you kind of look at its interior, it almost looks like there's kind of a lot of little air pockets or little air bubbles in the bones. Okay. And that's not an accident. So that's not a result of dead tissue either. Bones just naturally have those pores, those little air bubbles. Okay. right? And so these bubbles are this is where most of the water lives inside bones. And so the water that's inside bones, they live inside these little pockets, okay? And depending on how dense or how many of these bubbles there are in the bone, it's going to change the material properties of the bone. And so the way that we describe, how many bubbles or how dense the bubble network is, we call that porosity, okay? And so generally speaking, the more porous the bone is, the more flexible and the less strong it's going to be, okay? So more bubbles, less strength, but more flexibility, less bubbles, more strength, less flexibility. And so what you'll see is that for a lot of the major weight-bearing bones in your body, they're not very porous at all because they have to be quite strong. But for some of the other bones in your body, they can be more porous, because they don't have to be as strong. Okay? And in fact, even in a lot of bones, what you'll see is that there are certain parts that are more compacted and less porous. But at certain parts of the bone, mainly the ones at the ends that interact with the other joints, those tend to be a lot more porous because they experience a lot of impact. All right, any final questions on any of this before we wrap it up for today? Okay, all right, so that's all I got, all we can do for today. And so on Tuesday, we'll pick this up again and we'll continue talking about bones. And then from there, we'll transition to muscles. Okay? All right, so thank you everyone for coming today. I hope you guys had a good first week. Hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Yep.
Do birds have like really porous bones?
Who?
Do birds just have really porous bones?
I think, yeah,
It's like big bubbles.
yeah, because they don't do a lot of weight bearing because their bodies are naturally really light, and so yeah, their bones are pretty porous. But actually, bone, I know birds in particular, they have a lot of cartilage.
Oh, really?
So cartilage is another material which is a lot softer than bones. But I think it works for birds because they have to be a lot more flexible in terms of yeah, animal anatomy is fascinating. Right? If you look at different types of animals in terms of what they need to do, then their bodies kind of adapt to that. So you can actually look at the anatomy of an animal and kind of see how much running they do, how much flying they do, things. Yeah, so prosthetics. So that's so a lot of the ones that are out there now are made of plastics. So plastic kind of mimics a lot of those materials. It's quite light.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to have like equal weight, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's hard to replicate perfectly the exact same. Plastics can get pretty close. They may not be as strong, but then that's but I know numerous prosthetics nowadays are experimenting with different carbon fiber that are more lightweight and strong, but carbon fiber is also really expensive. And so there's still people are using it. Yeah. So I uploaded. We're doing activity today. I uploaded the I'm gonna share that. Any final questions? Okay. All right. I'm gonna close the call.